everyone. Hope you're having a wonderful day. I am coming on here to talk just a little bit about the temporal lobe and why it matters for singing teachers to know a little bit about this. Now, before we get too far into the weeds about this, I'll just tell you that first of all, I love anatomy. I love how everything works together. And I think that having knowledge like this can really, really be helpful for teachers. Can you teach singing without an intricate and in-depth knowledge of anatomy and all of that stuff? Absolutely, you can. But for folks who are like me, who could nerd out about this stuff for like hours, it really can add just kind of a fantastic spice to your teaching. I love to cook as well, and so one of the fun things that I really enjoy about cooking is experimenting. As an example, I made some homemade egg noodles on Monday. It was a holiday, so I had some extra time to kill in the kitchen, so I made some homemade egg noodles, which then turned into like a giant pot of chicken and noodles. And that's kind of like the main dish, that's the main thing. But the real fun part about that one for me was that I experimented with some different kinds of spices. So I put in some rosemary and some dill and some lemon thyme and got just kind of mixed up the flavors a little bit. And that's kind of how I view this topic, specifically like anatomy and all of that stuff with teaching. Like, you can definitely teach singing. That's like your main dish. But how you add in things like anatomy and neuroanatomy and all of that stuff, that's the spice that makes it unique, makes it yours. And for me, the learning of the anatomy and the physiology and all that stuff really made my teaching different. It made a difference to me. By the way, you may hear my dog walking around, his toenails clacking on the floor because he really wants to go on a ride right now. I went out to the car to look for something and he was so disappointed that we didn't get in and go somewhere. And so he keeps giving me the look and heading towards the car again. So I may have to take my dog for a ride when I'm done here. But anyway, he's anxious and a little disappointed in my life choices at the moment. So anyway, on the socials this week and on my blog, which you can find at drheathernelson.com/blog, I've been talking about the temporal lobe. And that's obviously in the brain. The brain is divided into 4 different lobes. The temporal lobe you can find because it's real easy to remember. It's under our temples here, and it's on either side. You have one on the right side, one on the left side, and they basically do the same kinds of things just for different sides of the body. And so the temporal lobe in our brains is so incredibly active in our singing. It does so much. Just our lives in general. It's the busiest, the biggest, the most powerful processing part of our brains. It works with our auditory system. It works with our visual system. It works with memory. It works with language. So many things. And so this part of our brain has quite a lot going on, and it has an incredible amount of activity whenever we sing. So just a few of the things that it does as we're singing, because it is connected to our auditory processing system, it is taking in all of the information that we're hearing. The nerves in our ears are, there he goes down the hall again. I'm telling you, he wants to go for a ride. So it's taking in the information that the nerves in our ears picks up, and it processes it. It gives it meaning. And so you can kind of think about the alphabet versus language. The nerves pick up information, raw information, and that's like kind of alphabet soup. It's like all of the letters, they're kind of jumbled together, and then the processing part of the brain takes that raw information and decides what it means. That takes the alphabet and turns it into language. So randomness into meaning. And that's what the processing part of our temporal lobe does. So the auditory part of the temporal lobe is taking in everything that we're hearing and giving it meaning, assigning it meaning. It may connect to the memory part of the temporal lobe as well and say, okay, I'm hearing this. It is this thing, but it's connected to this memory. For instance, I know exactly what my mother's voice sounds like because I can hear her talk. I can give meaning to what she's saying, but the memory part of my brain remembers what her voice sounds like. Now, in regards to singing, the temporal lobe is doing a whole lot. It is giving us information about our own sound. We can, of course, hear what sound we're producing, and it gives meaning to that. It can give us information about like how big a room we're in. If you think about you can close your eyes in whatever space you're in, and even close your eyes and like change spaces and get kind of a sense of how large a space is by what you're hearing and how echoes work, how reverberation works. That's the temporal lobe that's helping to process that kind of information. And we often can be fooled into or kind of almost tricked into, like, say, singing louder when we're in a larger space because we want to fill that space, and that's sometimes the temporal lobe running amok a little bit. So it's pulling in a lot of sound information. Of course, we're also listening to things that our teacher is saying, and the language and the hearing part are taking in those words and processing the language and assigning meaning to what our teachers are saying or what our students are saying back to us. So that's incredibly important as well. And that's just scratching the surface on the hearing part of our temporal lobes and how it works in our singing. I mean, that's like so small compared to what it does, but that'll kind of get us started. The memory part of our temporal lobes are also very, very important. That helps us in memorization. It helps us to learn language, like reading music. It helps us to learn how to sing in other languages if that's something that we're doing. We use so much of our memory centers in learning music and being able to repeat music. We've got, of course, short-term memory and we have long-term memory, and the temporal lobe has actions or has a part in communicating with both the amygdala and with the hippocampus to help get some of those short-term memories into long-term memory. I tell people a lot of times that what our brains need in order to move things from short-term memory into long-term memory is time, repetition, and sleep. Our amygdalas and our hippocampus, or hippocampi, I don't know what oh, now the cat's yelling at me. Those work a lot when we're asleep. So sleep is actually really, really essential for good singing technique and good singing health. So the memory section works in that way in our temporal lobe. We also, of course, I've mentioned the language section. We have language processing that happens in the temporal lobe, where it takes in the language that we're hearing or reading. Those are kind of a little bit different how they're processed, but that language is taken in and given meaning so that we can understand what we're being told, what we're reading, what we're hearing, all of those things. And so really, really, really important there. Also, the visual part of our temporal lobe, it does a lot of the same kinds of things that the hearing part does, where it takes in that raw information from the eyes, and together with the occipital lobe that's in the back. We'll talk about that in a few weeks' time. But it connects to the memory part of the temporal lobe as well. So it says, okay, I'm seeing this thing in front of me, and it kind of like flips through the files of our memory to decide whether you've seen this thing before, and if you have, what is it? And if you haven't, then it starts kind of making a new file of what that thing is and all of that stuff. We have a lot of emotional processing that happens in this part of our brain too, so this helps us to express ourselves. It also can go a little funky when sometimes our emotions get attached to memory. That can be tricky. Like people who have PTSD, for example, may have an emotional connection attached to a memory that isn't connected in the same way for other people. And that happens in this part of the brain very often. And so that can be a little tricky sometimes when emotions get tagged onto memories or onto like our little file system. It can get tagged onto files that might not have been connected in the same way for other people. And so that's something that we have to be mindful of. If someone has had a really, really negative performing experience sometime in their past, they may have some sort of an emotional trigger attached to that memory, to where if they enter into a new performing experience, even though it's a new thing, they still have that thing that has happened, and it can bring up some stuff. And so you may have to deal with that. Beyond that, of course, there are myriad kinds of ways that emotions can be expressed in both positive, negative, and in neutral ways. And that all happens in this part of our brains. Now, there's also a few things to be aware of, because we have differences in how brains can process things, particularly in relation to language. Things like or sensory. I hadn't mentioned that. Sensory processing. Oh my gosh, sensory processing. Huge thing that's happening in the temporal lobe, where we're taking in a whole bunch of sensory information and our brains are processing and telling us what this means. Glad I mentioned that. And I'm not even going to get into it because it's so much. But when we have things like attention deficit disorder, ADHD, even sometimes autism spectrum disorder, or other kinds of neurodivergence, very often they seem to have their origins in that part of the brain, in the temporal part of the brain where that processing is happening. And because that part of the brain may process things a little bit differently, that can help us to understand our clients a little bit better, I think. I'm going to talk about that in a second. One of the ways that the temporal lobe can be different is that when it's working the way that the textbooks tell us it should work, the temporal lobe processes things and not only gives it meaning, but tells us whether it's important or not. If you wanted a quick experiment to see how this works, go into a room, and it doesn't matter what's going on in the room, just go into the room and be quiet. Close your eyes, be silent for a moment, and listen. And after a while, very likely you'll start to hear things that you hadn't noticed before. You might notice like the fan on your computer, or a buzz from some electronics, or you might hear bird song out the window that you hadn't noticed before, or you might have been tuning out your children. Whatever, you will notice these things. And that's the temporal lobe in action, because the brain not only processes and gives meaning, but it tells us what we need to pay attention to and what's really not important at all, and it kind of checks that out. So we're hearing all of those things. We're taking in that raw information, all of those alphabet letters into the brain, and the nerves are taking them all in, and the brain is just deciding, okay, this word important, this word not important. And so it's not only about processing, but it's also about attention. Now, when some folks have a neurodivergence, their brains may not be able to decide what's important, and everything is given the same level of importance. And that's when people can get a bit of sensory overload, because their brains just cannot differentiate between, okay, I need to be listening to, what my teacher is saying right now, and ignoring the hum of the fan. But their brains are like, these are both equally important. And so they're going to be listening to the hum of the fan at the same level that they're listening to you teaching. And that is not, them doing it on purpose. That's their brain. And if we can understand that those kinds of changes happen at the neurological, at the anatomical, at the physiological level, we can actually adjust our teaching to be able to meet our students where they are. Now, like I said earlier, you can absolutely teach without knowing all of that stuff. But for me, it has made a shorter pass or a shorter trail from having a question, how do I work well with a student, to, okay, now I have a plan. It's just made that journey a little shorter for me. So being able to learn about the temporal lobe in particular and how it can express itself differently in different people has given me a better understanding of how I can adjust my teaching to work with different clients and with whatever particular needs that they have. It also has helped me to really come to be a little in awe of how our brains can express themselves differently. I know that there are different challenges that come with some of those kinds of neurodivergences, but I'm also quite in awe of just how powerful that processing part of our brain is. And it has given me just an overwhelming nerdy love for brains and how they work with singing. So that's a little like super like mile wide, inch deep look at how the temporal lobe works in our singing. And I hope that it gives you a couple of ideas on maybe how you can adjust your singing, your teaching too. Now, I haven't got into much about how you can actually take that information and turn it into, or how it can change your teaching. But here's a couple of things that I would love to propose to you to think about. If you are a person who has never considered learning more in depth about anatomy, particularly like a neuroanatomy or anything, I think, like I've mentioned before, sometimes it can help give us a shortcut from a problem to a solution, because we can identify sometimes what the problem, what we perceive the problem is, and then we can get to a solution. There's not a lot of information, honestly, in the singing literature about teaching folks with neurodivergence. There's more coming out, and there's some teachers that are talking about it a lot. Dr. Shannon Coates is one that has talked about this a lot, and there are some others, but we're still, in singing science in particular, we're still having to catch up a lot to get to this. But if you can kind of figure out what you think the problem is, there are other disciplines that can help us. There's music therapy, there's speech language pathology, there's even special education. We can go to people who are in those fields to help us out to reach this, to reach whatever student that we're working with. And that can be really helpful. If you're like me, learning about this stuff just makes me love singing more. I love this stuff. It's so much fun, and it gives me just a renewed awe for how the voice works. I have learned a lot about, vocal disorders and communication disorders. That was a big part of my PhD work. And it amazes me, I've said it many, many times, it amazes me that there are so many opportunities along the way for things to just go terribly wrong that it amazes me how often things just go right. And we open our mouths and the sound comes out and I'm amazed by it. It's so fascinating how intricate and how, just how complicated this process is, and that we can just pop off and do it is incredible to me. And so learning about this stuff has really increased my wonder about singing. I also think that knowing this stuff and being able to teach our students about this stuff in age-appropriate ways and, in a way that actually helps them can empower them to understand more about their singing voice. I know we know it. Singing is a holistic activity, and we're using our whole bodies, we're using our whole brains and all of that stuff. We can get a little fixated right here, and our students and their parents and our clients can get a little fixated on this part, but we're teaching a whole person. And let's say, for instance, just as an example, you've got a student, whatever age, that is just having a really, really, really rough time with rhythm. Doesn't matter what you have tried so far, rhythm is a problem, and they are having trouble reading it and executing it. And then you find out they have had a diagnosis of dyslexia. Well, come to find out, rhythm reading and language processing, particularly written word processing, are kind of similar. And so a lot of folks who have problems with rhythm will often have problems with reading and with language comprehension. And once you know that, that can give you an insight into how to teach them. But it can also tell your student, okay, yeah, you're going to have some problems with rhythm. And this is a way that your brain is. And it is not because you're not trying hard. It's not because you don't know what you're doing. Your brain is just going to take a little bit of a sidestep, and we're going to have to work on the path that your brain is on. And that can give your student information that can help to empower them to know that they're doing just fine. And if they need to, can give them a way to advocate for themselves. Maybe they're having trouble with an audition or whatever. They can say, okay, I also have dyslexia, and this happens to manifest itself sometimes in rhythm issues, but I'm working with my teacher on it, and we'll get this together. So learning about these things for me can turn into wonder in the voice. It can change the way that I teach, because often it gives me a shortcut from problem to solution, but can also empower my students to take control of their singing and understand how singing expresses itself in their particular bodies. And I think that is wonderful. I have yet to meet a student who is not interested in how their body works and how singing works in their body. I don't ever give them as much detail as I get into, because I can fall way down into rabbit holes sometimes. But I do try to give them enough information that they can also get a sense of wonder about the act of singing in their body, and have the information they need to advocate for themselves if they ever find themselves in that kind of a situation. Happens more often than we would probably like to admit, don't you? Don't you think sometimes students get into situations where they are questioned by an authority, and that's whether or not that should happen or not is another question for another day. But it can give them an answer to be able to say, this is what's happening and this is why. And I think that's valuable. All right, so I've rambled on and on enough. Just a quick recap. The temporal lobe, underneath your temples in your brain, it works with auditory processing, visual processing, sensory information, memory, and language processing. All of those things happening right under the sides of your head. So maybe give it a little massage and give it a little love today. It's working real hard for you. All right, I hope you have a wonderful day. Happy teaching, and we'll see you around.